I scratched another thin line into the cold concrete wall beside my bunk using the edge of a cracked plastic spoon. 731 marks. 731 days. That is how long I have been sitting in this cell because of my daughter-in-law's lies. 731 days to think. 731 days to plan how I am going to take back everything they stole from me. My name is Thomas Whitaker. I am 64 years old. Until 2 years ago, I owned Whitaker Homes, the biggest residential construction company in the province of Ontario. I did not inherit it. Nobody handed it to me. I started it with one old pickup truck, a dented metal toolbox, and a whole lot of stubborn determination when I was 23 years old. My late wife, Margaret, stood beside me from the very beginning. We worked weekends. We skipped vacations. We poured every dollar back into the company. We believed we were building something that would outlive us. When cancer took her 8 years ago, I stood at her hospital bed and promised her I would protect what we built. I promised her our children would carry it forward. I have 2 children. My son, Brandon, is 41. I trained him for years to take over the business one day. My daughter, Allison, is 36. She became a family law attorney. Both of them were sharp. Both of them were raised to believe that hard work and honesty were not optional. Or at least, that is what I believed at the time. 3 years ago, Brandon married a woman named Vanessa Hale. She was 32 years old, used to work as an event coordinator, and she had a smile that could light up a whole room. She also had a taste for expensive things and a way of looking at people like she was measuring what they were worth. From the first dinner we shared together, I felt uneasy. I could not explain it, but it sat heavy in my gut. She chose her words carefully, like she was always performing. Her eyes wandered around my study, pausing on the framed photographs of our lakefront properties. When Brandon tried to talk business with me, she would cut in and redirect the conversation. But my son was in love. Not just in love, blinded by it. And I kept my mouth shut. That is what fathers do. We tell ourselves our kids are grown. We tell ourselves they know what they are doing, even when something deep inside says otherwise. The first real red flag showed up about 14 months after their wedding. Brandon called and asked me to come to their downtown condominium. He said it was urgent family business. His voice sounded tight, nervous. I drove there right away. When I walked in, Vanessa was sitting on their white leather sofa. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. Her face looked carefully arranged into sadness. Brandon stood next to her with his hand resting on her shoulder. His expression was serious. They told me Vanessa was pregnant. For months along. They said they had waited to share the news because there had been complications. The doctor had ordered strict bed rest. Brandon said he needed to step back from the company for a while so he could take care of her. I congratulated them. I meant it. I told them we would handle things at the office. I offered to hire extra management support. I even suggested they move into my house so I could help out. Vanessa turned down every offer. She smiled sweetly, but her eyes stayed cold. She said the situation required privacy. She said stress could endanger the baby. She said they needed space. Brandon would work from home as much as he could. Over the next 2 months, my son changed. He stopped coming to board meetings. He returned my calls hours later, sometimes not at all. When we did speak, Vanessa was always in the background. I could hear her breathing, shifting, listening. Allison noticed it too. One Sunday evening after dinner, when Brandon and Vanessa did not show up, Allison pulled me aside. She told me something was not right. She said Vanessa controlled every move Brandon made. She said her brother looked drained and worn down. She told me that when she visited their condominium, Vanessa would only let her stay 20 minutes before claiming she was too sensitive for visitors. I brushed it off. I told Allison she was overthinking things. I said Brandon was just being a supportive husband. I told her to give them time. I should have listened to my daughter. Everything exploded on a Wednesday afternoon in late September. I was at the office reviewing architectural drawings for a new development in Mississauga when my phone rang. It was Brandon. His voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand him. He said Vanessa had fallen. He said she was bleeding. He said she was at Toronto General Hospital. He said they were losing the baby. I left immediately and drove straight to the emergency room. I found Brandon sitting in the waiting area with his head buried in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red and empty. He said, "She lost the baby. The doctors tried, but they could not save it." Then he looked straight at me and said, "This is your fault, Dad." It felt like somebody punched me in the chest. I asked him what he was talking about. How could that possibly be my fault? That is when Vanessa appeared in the hallway, leaning on a nurse for support. Her hospital gown was perfectly clean. Her makeup looked smeared just enough to appear tragic. She stared at me and said, clear as day, "You did this." I could not speak. She began telling her version of events right there. She claimed I had gone to their condominium that morning furious about Brandon missing work. She said I grabbed her arm during an argument. She said when she tried to pull away, I shoved her. She said she fell down the 3 steps that led into their living room. She said she started bleeding immediately. She said I threatened her, and that she was too afraid to call for help. Every single word was a lie. I had not been near their condominium in 2 months. I had been at my office all morning. 7 employees could confirm it. But Vanessa performed like an award-winning actress. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Her hands trembled. When I stepped closer, she flinched like I was dangerous. Brandon believed her. My own son looked at me with disgust, like I was a stranger. The nurse called security. Security called the police. Within an hour, I was sitting in an interrogation room at 52 Division, being questioned about assault causing bodily harm and criminal negligence resulting in the death of an unborn child. I kept repeating that I had not been there. I told them to check with my project manager, my secretary, anyone at the office. The detective handling the case was young and hungry to prove himself. He looked at me like I was just another wealthy old man who thought money could protect him. That same night, they formally charged me. The judge refused to grant bail. He said I had the financial resources to flee. He said the seriousness of the charges required detention. He even suggested my age did not make me harmless. My attorney, Jonathan Pierce, was one of the best criminal defense lawyers in Toronto. But the case was stacked against us. Vanessa had photographs of bruises on her arm that she claimed I caused. She had medical records confirming the miscarriage. A neighbor provided a statement saying they heard shouting that morning. I told Jonathan the neighbor was lying. I told him to demand security footage from my office. I told him to interview every employee. But Brandon moved faster than I expected. As majority shareholder once I was arrested, he froze the company accounts under the excuse of conducting an internal audit. He claimed he was investigating financial irregularities. What he really did was block my access to the legal defense fund I had established for emergencies. Jonathan tried to represent me without payment at first, but the case dragged on. 6 months passed, then 9, then a full year. The courts were backed up. Evidence was delayed. Witnesses suddenly became unavailable. And I sat in this cell, carving lines into the wall, watching my life disappear piece by piece. 731 days. And I am not finished yet. And I sat inside the Toronto East Detention Center, watching my entire life fall apart through stacks of legal paperwork and short, monitored phone calls. Allison believed me. She never doubted me for a second. She fought harder than anyone else ever did. She hired private investigators with money she did not really have. She dug into Vanessa's story piece by piece. And the more she dug, the more cracks she found. The neighbor who claimed he heard us arguing that morning? He turned out to be one of Vanessa's old co-workers from her event planning days. The medical documents Vanessa submitted? They came from a clinic that already had a reputation for sloppy practices and questionable billing. Those bruises she showed in the photographs? They only appeared in pictures Vanessa took herself. The emergency room staff never documented them in their official report. But fighting for me cost Allison dearly. Her law practice was barely staying afloat. She still had student loan debt hanging over her head. And when she pushed too aggressively on my behalf, Brandon retaliated. He cut her off financially. He removed her from the company insurance plan. He stopped answering her calls completely. Then Vanessa filed a restraining order against my daughter, claiming harassment. My own child was forced to choose between defending her father and protecting her own kids. I told her to stop. I told her to step back. I told her to take care of her family. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Up until then, I had been a desperate man shouting that he was innocent. After that, I became patient. Inside detention, I had time. Endless time. 18 hours a day inside a concrete box does something to a man. It strips away panic. It forces you to think clearly. I stopped trying to convince everyone I was innocent. I stopped filing frantic legal motions. I stopped waiting for the system to rescue me. Instead, I started preparing. I became friendly with another inmate named Leonard Kim. He was a forensic accountant waiting for trial on embezzlement charges. Leonard knew things that no business school ever teaches. He taught me how money really moves. He explained how assets can be protected through numbered corporations. He showed me how to follow financial patterns, how to spot manipulation, how to build documentation strong enough to survive courtroom scrutiny. I used my limited phone privileges carefully. I did not waste them arguing with Brandon. I did not call Vanessa to scream at her. Instead, I contacted old associates, men and women I had worked with for decades. People Brandon barely knew. People who trusted me because I had treated them fairly for years. I asked them to quietly observe what was happening at Whitaker Homes. And what I learned made my blood run cold. Brandon was making reckless decisions. He was overextending credit. He was accepting contracts with impossible deadlines just to generate fast cash. He was cutting safety corners to increase profit margins. Vanessa convinced him to mortgage 3 of our properties to finance a luxury condominium project that was already bleeding money before it even broke ground. The company I spent 40 years building was slowly collapsing, and I did nothing. That was the hardest part. I forced myself to stay still, because every mistake Brandon made created a record. Every rushed contract left documentation. Every unsafe decision left evidence. Every mortgage, every signature, every missed payment created a trail. The trial finally began in the 19th month of my detention. The prosecution came in confident. They did not stay confident for long. Allison's investigators had done their job thoroughly. The so-called neighbor withdrew his statement when confronted with phone records proving he was in Montreal the morning Vanessa claimed he heard us arguing. The clinic that provided her medical records was under formal investigation for fraud. The photographs of her bruises could not be verified by independent medical staff. And then came the detail that shattered everything. Emergency room documentation showed Vanessa had been treated for a miscarriage 3 days before the date she claimed I assaulted her. The pregnancy was already over. There was no fall that caused it. The entire story had been constructed in advance. It was planned. It was deliberate. It was designed to remove me from control of the company so Brandon and Vanessa could take everything. The judge dismissed all charges. He issued an apology on behalf of the court. He referred Vanessa's actions for possible perjury prosecution, and he ordered my immediate release. I walked out of the Toronto East Detention Center on a cold morning in March, 731 days after I walked in. Jonathan Pierce was waiting for me outside with a bag of clean clothes and a full report on the damage. Brandon had nearly destroyed Whitaker Homes. The company was 90 days away from insolvency, $7 million in debt, contractors suing for unpaid invoices, vendors cutting ties, our reputation shredded. But Brandon did not know everything. 20 years earlier, I had taken out a key person insurance policy on myself. If I became incapacitated for more than 18 months, the policy paid $5 million. The money had already been deposited into a trust account, untouched, because Brandon did not know the policy existed. He also did not know something else. Before my arrest, I had quietly transferred 49% of the company's shares to a numbered corporation. On paper, I personally held 51%, but that numbered corporation controlled the remaining shares, and that corporation was held in trust for Allison. Brandon believed he had control with his 51%. He was wrong. I did not go straight home after my release. Instead, I checked into a hotel near the financial district. I stood under a hot shower for nearly an hour, washing off 2 years of institutional soap and recycled air. I ordered room service. I ate slowly. Real food, not something served on a plastic tray. Then I called Allison. She started crying the moment she heard my voice. She said she would come to me right away. I told her to wait. There was something I needed to do first. Then I called Brandon. He answered on the 4th ring. His voice was cautious, careful. He already knew I had been released. He was probably expecting anger, accusations, demands. Instead, I invited him to lunch the following day. The King Edward Hotel. 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Just father and son. He agreed, but I could hear the confusion in his tone. I arrived early and chose a corner table where I could see the entire dining room. Brandon walked in 10 minutes late. He looked older. Gray streaked through his dark hair. Worry lines marked his forehead. His suit was expensive, but it did not hide the tightness in his shoulders. He sat down without looking directly at me. I ordered the same meal we had shared dozens of times during business lunches over the years. For several minutes, neither of us spoke while the waiter poured water and placed bread on the table. Finally, Brandon said he was sorry. He said he believed his wife. He said everything spiraled out of control. I did not answer right away. I tore off a piece of bread. I buttered it slowly. I took a bite. Then I looked straight at my son. I told him I knew everything. The mortgaged properties, the failed condominium project, the $7 million in debt, the contractors filing lawsuits, the employees he had laid off, every single disaster. The color drained from his face. Then I told him something else. I told him about the numbered corporation. I told him about the shares he thought he controlled but did not. I told him about the $5 million insurance payout sitting quietly in trust. I told him about the documentation Allison's investigators had compiled detailing his financial mismanagement. And then I said it plainly. I told him I had the power to destroy him. Professionally, financially, personally. I looked straight at my son and told him that with one phone call to my attorneys, I could take everything from him. Every asset, every title, every ounce of control he thought he had. Brandon opened his mouth to respond, but I raised my hand and stopped him. Then I said something he did not expect. I am not going to do that. The confusion on his face was obvious. If I had been looking for satisfaction, I would have enjoyed that moment. But those 731 days had changed me. Destroying someone might feel powerful for a second, but it leaves nothing standing afterward. Real justice is harder than revenge. Real justice teaches. I told Brandon that I was reclaiming control of Whitaker Homes immediately. Effective that day, I would resume leadership. He would stay with the company, but not as an executive. He would work as a regular employee. He would start in the field. He would learn the business from the ground up, the same way I did 4 decades ago. And he would report directly to Allison, who would become the new chief operating officer. I explained that the $5 million from the insurance policy would pull the company back from the edge of insolvency. But that money would only be used if he accepted my terms. If he refused, I would let the company collapse. And he could deal with personal bankruptcy on his own. Then I gave him one final condition. Vanessa was not part of this arrangement. If he wanted redemption, he would have to choose his marriage or his future. Brandon sat there, completely still. His lunch sat untouched in front of him. I stood up, placed 3 $50 bills on the table, and walked out of the restaurant. That night at 11 o'clock, my phone rang. He agreed to everything. He told me he was filing for divorce the next morning. The rebuilding of Whitaker Homes took 8 long months. When I walked back into the office, it looked like a storm had passed through. Files were stacked everywhere. Projects were half finished. Employees were discouraged and uncertain. Contractors were angry. The first month, I did nothing but stabilize. I called contractors personally. I negotiated structured payment plans. I met with clients face-to-face to reassure them we would honor our commitments. Allison stepped into her role as chief operating officer like she had been born for it. She untangled the financial disaster with calm precision. She renegotiated debts. She secured new lines of credit. She rewrote contracts to protect us from further risk. Brandon worked in the field. I assigned him to the toughest projects we had. Renovations in crumbling old buildings. New builds with impossible timelines. Jobs that required long days and hands-on labor. He worked 12-hour shifts. He came home covered in dust, paint, and sweat. He learned what it truly meant to build something with his own hands instead of signing papers in a glass office. For the first 3 months, he avoided me. All communication went through Allison. He submitted daily reports. He never asked for a meeting. I let him have that space. Some lessons need quiet to sink in. Meanwhile, Vanessa hired 3 separate attorneys trying to claim a share of Brandon's assets during the divorce. Each time, her lawyers ran into the same reality. Brandon had nothing left. The shares he thought he owned were wrapped inside complex corporate structures. The properties were mortgaged beyond their actual value. His personal accounts were drained to cover debts. In the end, she accepted $50,000 and vanished from our lives. The perjury charges against her moved slowly through the legal system. Her trial was scheduled for the following year. I attended every preliminary hearing. Not to glare at her. Not to speak. Just to sit quietly in the gallery. to remind her that truth does not disappear forever. 6 months after I returned to the company, Brandon asked to meet me. Not at the office. At the original Whitaker Homes warehouse in Scarborough. The small building where I started everything decades earlier. We still owned it and used it for equipment storage. When I walked inside, Brandon was standing alone in the open space, staring at the old photographs hanging on the walls. Pictures of my first construction crew. The first house we ever built. A photo of Margaret and me cutting a ribbon at our first major development. He turned when he heard my footsteps. This time, he looked me in the eye. He told me he had been a fool. He said Vanessa had studied our family before they ever met. She deliberately approached him at a charity event. She used hormone supplements to fake pregnancy symptoms. She staged the miscarriage with medical paperwork purchased from a corrupt clinic. But he said the worst part was not losing money. The worst part was realizing he had sent his own father to prison. He said he chose lies over a lifetime of proof that I would never harm anyone. He said he had been so blinded by what he believed was love that he destroyed the only real love he ever had. His family. Then my 41-year-old son broke down in tears like a child. Every instinct in me wanted to hug him, to tell him everything was fine. But that would have been too easy. Some pain has to leave a mark before healing can begin. Instead, I told him about the men I met while I was locked up. I told him about Samuel. Samuel spent 19 years in prison for a crime his brother committed. He protected his brother out of loyalty. But when Samuel was finally released, his brother avoided him. The guilt had poisoned everything. Samuel never forgave him. He lived 12 more years bitter and alone before dying of a heart attack. Then I told him about David. David was wrongfully convicted of assault. His wife divorced him while he was inside. His children slowly stopped visiting. 7 years later, new evidence proved he was innocent. But by then, his family had rebuilt their lives without him. They were relieved he was cleared. But there was no place for him anymore. He tried to force himself back into their world. He demanded visitation. He showed up uninvited. Eventually, his own children filed restraining orders against him. Both men allowed their pain to define the rest of their lives. I looked at Brandon and told him I would not become one of them. I admitted that I had spent 731 days thinking about revenge. But somewhere along the way, I realized something important. True justice is not about punishment. It is about restoration. Not restoring what used to be, because that is impossible, but restoring what can still be built. Then I told my son something he did not expect. I told him I forgave him. He stared at me like I was speaking a different language. So I explained. Forgiveness does not mean pretending nothing happened. It does not erase consequences. It does not remove accountability. Forgiveness means choosing to believe that a person can learn, and that a family, if it is willing to do the work, can build again. I told Brandon that forgiveness means making room for redemption, even when redemption feels impossible. But I also told him something important. Forgiveness is not a single moment. It is a process. It is slow. It is earned. If he wanted my trust back, he would have to rebuild it the same way we rebuild anything else. Piece by piece. Project by project. Year by year. I told him I could not promise how long it would take. I could not promise that we would ever be as close as we once were. But I was willing to try. If he was. Brandon nodded. He could not speak. The words would not come. We stood there in that empty warehouse for a long time, surrounded by old tools and faded memories. Finally, I reached into my bag and pulled out a set of blueprints. It was a small residential project in Etobicoke. 3 townhouses. Modest budget. Tight deadline. I handed them to him. This one is yours, I said. He would serve as lead contractor. He would oversee everything from pouring the foundation to the final coat of paint. I would be available if he needed advice. But the decisions would be his. The outcome would be his. We both understood what it was. A test. He studied the drawings carefully. I could see something familiar return to his face. The training he had grown up with. The instincts he once trusted. He asked smart questions. About soil conditions. About suppliers. About crew assignments. I answered each one. And slowly, over the next hour, we began to sound like we used to. Not enemies. Not strangers. But father and son again. Teacher and student. 2 men building something that might last. The project took 4 months. Brandon made mistakes. He ordered duplicate materials because he forgot to check inventory. He misread electrical plans and had to redo a full week of work. He went over budget by 8%, but he finished on time. The quality met our standards. And he did everything honestly. No shortcuts, no hidden problems. When he discovered a foundation issue halfway through, he called me immediately. We solved it together. The townhouses sold within 3 weeks of completion. The buyers were happy. Brandon personally walked each family through their new home, answering questions and promising to handle any concerns. After the final family left, he sat down on the front steps of the center unit. I joined him. We watched the sun set over the neighborhood. 3 modest buildings stood in front of us. Proof that rebuilding is possible. Brandon told me he finally understood what I had tried to teach him his entire life. Construction is not just about walls and roofs. It is about creating homes where people will live their lives. It is about leaving something better than you found it. It is about integrity when nobody is watching. He admitted he wasted years chasing the wrong things, trying to impress people who did not matter, collecting possessions instead of strengthening relationships, confusing control with success. Then he said something that surprised me. He said my imprisonment might have been the best thing that ever happened to him, not because of my suffering, but because it shattered every illusion he had. It forced him to see clearly. I told him I wished there had been an easier way for both of us to learn that lesson. We both laughed. It was not joyful laughter. It was the kind that comes from surviving something dark. That was 2 years ago. Today, Whitaker Homes is strong again. Allison runs daily operations with a level of discipline I never had. Brandon manages field crews and has earned respect for his focus on safety and quality. I serve as chairman now. I focus on long-term strategy. I mentor younger contractors who remind me of myself when I was starting out. Brandon and I have dinner together every Sunday. Sometimes the conversation flows easily. Sometimes there is still tension. Trust takes time to rebuild. Allison's law practice has grown into a respected firm. She now focuses on cases involving elder abuse and financial exploitation. She fights for people who have been betrayed the way I was. Vanessa was convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice. She served 14 months at the Vanier Center for Women. She was released last autumn and moved to Vancouver. Last I heard, she works in retail. I hope she has found some kind of peace. I do not hate her. Hate takes too much energy. What she did was wrong. But forgiveness is not something I offer for her benefit. It is something I choose for my own. People ask me how I survived 2 years of wrongful imprisonment without turning bitter. They expect me to talk about meditation, or religion, or extraordinary inner strength. The truth is simpler and harder. I survived by refusing to let the worst chapter of my life become the entire book. Yes, I spent 731 days behind bars for a crime I did not commit. Yes, my own son believed a lie. Yes, I lost 2 years I will never get back. Those are facts. They are part of my story, but they are not the end of it. I also spent 40 years building a company that employed hundreds of people and built homes for thousands of families. I raised 2 children who are now making the world better in their own ways. I loved a woman who showed me what partnership truly means. I mentored young men and women who went on to build businesses of their own. One terrible chapter does not erase everything that came before it, or everything that comes after it. Here is what I have learned. Life will betray you. Not maybe. It will. Someone you trust will hurt you. Something unfair will happen. You will face moments that feel impossible to survive. When that moment comes, you will have a choice. You can let betrayal define you. You can grow bitter. You can replay your pain for the rest of your life. Or you can acknowledge the hurt, feel it fully, and then choose to build something better from the wreckage. I chose to build. Every morning, I wake up in my home overlooking Lake Ontario. I make coffee the way Margaret taught me. I read the newspaper. I call my children. I go to work. I solve problems. I guide young builders who are just starting their journey. Is my life perfect? No. Do I still sometimes remember the sound of that steel cell door closing and feel my chest tighten? Yes. Do I sometimes look at Brandon and wonder if forgiveness is fully complete? Of course. But every day I choose to build. One conversation at a time. One decision at a time. One project at a time. Because that is what builders do. We take raw materials. We take broken pieces. We take difficult ground. And we create something new. Something useful. Something lasting. Those 731 marks I carved into that cell wall are still there. I asked the facility not to paint over them. I was told they remain. Maybe someday another man who does not belong there will see them. Maybe he will count them. Maybe he will understand that he is not alone. Maybe he will remember that even the longest sentence ends. And when it does, he will face the same choice I faced. Destroy or build. Bitter or better. My name is Thomas Whitaker. I am 66 years old. I own Whitaker Homes, one of the largest residential construction companies in Ontario. I spent 2 years in detention for a crime I did not commit. But that is not my story. My story is what I chose to build afterward.